It started on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I had barely finished my shift at the bookstore and was enjoying the rare serenity of an empty apartment. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds accompanying me. I had always considered myself a skeptic, the kind of person who rationalized strange occurrences with logic. But that night logic abandoned me. The first call came at exactly 8:13 p.m. My phone, resting on the coffee table, vibrated with a low buzz. I glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number flashing. It wasn't one of those spam numbers. I recognized the local area code. Hesitant but curious, I answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice tinged with both politeness and caution. For a few moments, there was nothing but static on the other end. It wasn't the kind of static you'd hear from a bad connection. It was deeper, almost like the low growl of wind through a canyon. "Hello? Who's this?" I repeated, my fingers tightening around the phone. A voice finally broke through the static, but it wasn't what I expected. It was soft, almost a whisper, and yet it felt like it was right next to my ear. "Do you remember me?" the voice asked. A chill ran down my spine. The voice wasn't familiar, but there was something about its tone, almost as if the words carried a weight, a memory I couldn't quite grasp. "I think you've got the wrong number," I said quickly, and hung up. I shook it off, blaming it on a prank or someone dialing the wrong number. But as I set the phone back down, I couldn't ignore the lingering unease, the way the voice had spoken. It wasn't casual. It felt deliberate, like it was meant for me. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "I told you you have the wrong number," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This time, the static was clearer, almost rhythmic, like it was breathing. And then the voice returned, a little louder now. "You don't remember, but you should." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my nerves starting to fray. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it whispered something that froze the blood in my veins. "Look outside." I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to do it. But something, curiosity, fear, or perhaps both, forced me to my feet. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty, no cars, no pedestrians. Just the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment I felt relief. Maybe it was just a prank after all. But then I saw it. Across the street, beneath the flickering light of a lamppost, stood a figure. It was hard to make out any details, but they were facing directly at my window. My breath hitched as the voice on the phone spoke again, almost as if it knew what I was seeing. "You left me there. Don't you remember?" The figure took a single step forward, and I stumbled back from the window, dropping the phone. The call ended with a sharp, piercing tone that echoed in the silence of my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind felt amplified, like it was alive, watching, waiting. And as the minutes dragged on, I realized something chilling. That voice, it wasn't entirely unfamiliar. It was buried deep in my memory, in a place I had tried so hard to forget. But why? And what had I left behind? The next morning came slowly, dragging its feet like it knew what had happened during the night I hadn't slept at all. I spent the entire night sitting in my living room, phone gripped tightly in my hand, staring at the window. The figure outside had disappeared at some point, but the memory of their silhouette remained etched in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a prank. Someone with too much time on their hands, but deep down I didn't believe that. The voice on the phone, the cryptic message, it felt personal, almost like a thread pulling at something buried deep in my subconscious. I tried to brush it off as I went about my day. At work, I avoided telling anyone about it. How could I? Hey, I think someone's calling me from my past, but I have no idea who they are. It sounded absurd, even to me. But the calls didn't stop. That evening, as I unlocked my apartment door, I hesitated. The hallway was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally stepped inside, I locked the door behind me and double-checked it. Something I rarely did. It wasn't long before the phone rang again. The same number. This time, I didn't wait. I answered immediately. "What do you want?" I snapped. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but that only made it worse. "You still don't remember, do you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I shouted. "Stop calling me." There was a pause, and then the voice said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not safe. It's already started." "Who are you?" I demanded. But the line went dead. A loud thud came from the other side of the apartment. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. Slowly, I crept toward the source of the noise. My bedroom. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, I froze. The room was empty except for the bed, the dresser, and my nightstand. But lying on the bed was something that shouldn't have been there. An old rotary phone. I hadn't owned one of those in my life. It was an ancient relic, yellowed with age, the kind you'd expect to see in a museum or a horror movie. And yet there it was, sitting on my bed. Its receiver slightly off the hook, as if someone had just used it. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. The phone wasn't plugged into anything. It didn't even have a cord. But as I stood there, staring at it, the dial began to spin on its own, clicking as it moved through each number. A soft ringing filled the room, and my phone buzzed in my pocket simultaneously. I pulled it out and saw the same number flashing on the screen. My breath quickened as I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" The voice was louder now, more insistent. "Do you remember the house?" "What house?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You were there," it said. "You promised you'd come back, but you didn't." Images began to flash in my mind, blurry and fragmented. A dark hallway, a wooden staircase, the creak of floorboards under my feet. But none of it made sense. I didn't know this house. Or at least, I didn't think I did. The call ended abruptly, but the room was no longer silent. A faint knocking sound echoed from the walls. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was inside, like something was trapped in the walls, trying to get out. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut, and grabbed my keys. I needed to get out of there, even if I didn't know where to go. As I fumbled to lock the front door, I noticed something odd. There was a slip of paper wedged between the door and the frame. One I was sure hadn't been there when I came home. It was an old photograph, faded and torn at the edges. In it, I saw a group of children standing in front of a large, decrepit house. They looked familiar, but one face stood out. It was me, much younger, maybe 10 or 11 years old. I flipped the photo over, and in shaky handwriting, someone had scrawled a single sentence: "Come back to where it began." I felt a sudden pang of nausea, my head spinning as more fragments of memory fought their way to the surface. The house, the promise, the one I had left behind. I didn't have time to process it before my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call, but a text. It was from the same number, and the message was chillingly simple. "Hurry, you're running out of time." I didn't know where to go or who to turn to. The only thing I knew was that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop until I confronted it. And somehow, I knew that the house in the photograph held the answers. As I grabbed my coat and stepped into the night, the rotary phone in my bedroom began to ring again, its sharp sound echoing through the empty apartment. I didn't remember how I ended up there. The drive was a blur, my mind racing with fragments of a memory that felt both mine and alien. The photo of the house lay crumpled in my pocket, its edges damp from the sweat of my trembling hands. The road stretched ahead, shrouded in mist, and the further I drove, the less familiar the world felt. Then I saw it. The house stood at the end of a dirt path, its decayed frame rising like a phantom from the fog. The windows were dark, lifeless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching from inside. I parked the car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave, and forget this nightmare. But the calls, the whispers, the photograph, they wouldn't let me. I stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes unnervingly loud in the silence. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was breathing. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. I didn't remember reaching for it, but suddenly I was inside. The house smelled of damp wood and decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step echoing through the empty halls. It was eerily familiar. Every creak, every shadow felt like déjà vu. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Just the oppressive silence, broken only by the faint hum of the wind through broken windows. Then I saw it. A spiral staircase at the end of the hall, just like in the flashes of memory that had haunted me. The railing was chipped, its once polished wood now splintered and worn. As I placed a hand on it, a flood of images hit me like a tidal wave. A group of children laughing, their voices echoing up the stairs. A whispered dare to climb to the attic. The feeling of dread as I reached the top, my hand trembling on the doorknob. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The memories were too vivid, too real. But they didn't explain the voice on the phone, or why I was here now. Taking a deep breath, I ascended the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the attic door, my breath was visible in the dim light. The door was locked, but as I reached into my pocket, I found an old rusted key. I didn't question how it got there. I simply turned the lock and pushed the door open. The attic was a cavernous space, filled with forgotten relics covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the dim glow of the moon through a small window barely illuminated the room. In the center of the attic stood an old wooden chair. Sitting on it was a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, and its dress tattered. But it wasn't the doll itself that terrified me. It was the feeling it radiated. It was as if the air around it was alive, vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed the phone. It was another rotary phone, identical to the one that had appeared in my bedroom. It sat on the floor beside the chair, its receiver off the hook, and it was ringing. My hands shook as I picked it up. The moment I pressed it to my ear, the voice returned. "You came back," it said almost approvingly. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. "You broke your promise." The voice hissed, no longer soft. It was sharp, filled with anger. "You left me here, alone." "What promise?" "I don't remember," I shouted, my voice echoing through the attic. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing deeper, thicker. The doll's head tilted slightly, as if it was watching me. "You said you'd stay," the voice continued. "You said you'd play with me forever, but you ran away. You left me to rot in the dark." The memories hit me like a freight train. I was 10 years old, playing with a group of neighborhood kids in this very house. We dared each other to explore the attic. And when we found the doll, someone, me, had placed it on the chair as a joke. But the joke wasn't funny for long. The room had grown cold, the air heavy, and we'd all felt it. A presence. One by one, the other kids ran, leaving me behind. I'd heard the whispers back then too. The promises, the warnings. But I'd ignored them, running down the stairs and out of the house, never looking back. "I didn't mean to leave you," I said, my voice trembling. "I was just a kid. I was scared." "You should have come back," the voice said. And the doll's remaining eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light. The shadows in the room began to move, creeping toward me like living things. The chair creaked, as if something unseen was shifting its weight. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know." "Sorry won't help you now," the voice snarled. "You broke the rules, and now you'll stay, forever." The shadows lunged toward me, and the last thing I heard was the sound of the rotary phone spinning wildly, its clicks blending into the echo of my own screams. When I opened my eyes, I was still in the attic, but everything had changed. The air was thick with a suffocating darkness, and the shadows that had lunged at me seemed to pulsate, alive and watching. The doll was gone, and the chair sat empty, its wood creaking as though someone unseen had just stood up. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as though unseen hands were holding me in place. The rotary phone lay on the floor beside me, its dial slowly spinning on its own. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted into the void, my voice echoing back at me. The answer came, not through the phone this time, but from everywhere at once. A voice that was no longer human, but a chorus of whispers and screams. "You forgot me. You broke your promise. Now, you'll take my place." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. The shadows shifted, and before me appeared the faint outline of a child. A little girl, her features obscured, but her presence unmistakable. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, now torn and stained. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and black. "You left me here," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger and sorrow. "You promised to play with me forever, but you ran." I waited and waited, but no one came back. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The voice, the doll, the haunting presence. It was her. A spirit trapped in this house, bound by a childish promise I had made and broken decades ago. "I didn't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I didn't understand what I was promising. I was scared. You left me, she repeated, her voice growing louder, the room trembling with her fury. And now you'll stay. Forever. The shadows surged toward me again, wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me toward the chair. I fought against them, but they were too strong, their grip cold and unrelenting. No, I screamed. Please, I'll make it right. I'll help you. The shadows hesitated, and the little girl's form flickered, as though she was considering my words. You can't help me, she said softly. I'm already gone. Then let me set you free, I pleaded. You don't have to stay here anymore. You don't have to haunt this place. For a moment, the room fell silent. The darkness seemed to retreat slightly, and the girl's form became clearer. Her expression softened, and I saw the pain in her eyes, the pain of a child who had been forgotten, left alone in the dark for far too long. How? She whispered, her voice filled with longing. I'll remember you, I said. I'll tell your story. You won't be forgotten. The shadows began to dissolve, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. The girl stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch mine. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was gentle. Promise me, she said, her voice trembling. I promise, I said, my voice steady. I won't break it this time. She nodded, a faint smile appearing on her lips, and then, just like that, she was gone. The shadows vanished, and the room was bathed in the pale light of the moon. The rotary phone lay silent on the floor. Its dial still, the oppressive presence that had filled the house was gone, replaced by a strange, peaceful stillness. I left the house that night, but I didn't leave the memory behind. I kept my promise. I wrote down everything, the phone calls, the house, the girl. I shared her story, making sure the world would remember her, that she would never be forgotten again. And as I closed the final page of her story, my phone buzzed one last time. It was the same unknown number. This time, there was no fear as I answered. Thank you. Her voice whispered soft and free before the line went dead.